Hello, I'm Ben Orchard.
And I'm Claire Fitzpatrick.
Welcome to Sword, Sorcery and Synthesizers, the 80s fantasy movie podcast. I'm coming to you from Adelaide.
And I'm in Brisbane.
But through the wonders of modern technology and the magic of Skype, we meet each week to discuss some beloved movie of a bygone era and see what lies behind the nostalgia. I remember during our Field of Dreams episode, I asked you if you'd ever watched a movie and thought to yourself, how on earth did they get the funding to make this film? That was the thought that was sort of running through my mind when I was watching Field of Dreams. And I went into detail about that in our previous episode. But I remember your answer to me was, the film that made you think, oh, God, how did they get the funding for this was Gothic, a film by Ken Russell from the mid-'80s, a very fanciful film about the lives of Lord Byron and Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley.
Yeah, it's such a bizarre film. I'm a massive Mary Shelley fan. Frankenstein's my favorite novel. I do scholarly research on it. You know, I've seen many different adaptations of Frankenstein, but this is something that is not an adaptation of Frankenstein. It is an adaptation, very loosely, of the actual lives of Mary Shelley and Lord Byron, and I guess that weekend in Lake Geneva in 1816.
Well, let's just talk a bit about our credentials here. I am somebody who knows next to nothing about the lives of Lord Byron or Percy Shelley or Mary Shelley, and I haven't really dived too deeply into their literary work either.
Mm-hmm.
What I've read, I've read Frankenstein, and that's it as far as Mary Shelley's work is concerned. I've read some of Percy Shelley's poetry and Lord Byron's poetry, but I don't know much about like their longer form works. I've never read Lord Byron's Don Juan, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know much about their lives, their personalities, who they were as individuals, or what their relationships were. Whereas you, Claire, you have written various scholarly essays on the subject, and you've studied their lives in detail, and you edited a book which is a collection of essays on Mary Shelley and her mum, Mary Wollstonecraft, called A Vindication of Monsters, which I believe is now up for an award.
Yeah. So, A Vindication of Monsters, essays of Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley, I conceived and edited it. The reason it has conceived and edited is because it was a project of mine that came around about, I think it was like 2019. And I really wanted to put together a book of scholarly research about Mary Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft, but also in a way that is really accessible to readers. So anyone could just pick it up and be able to read things and not need to know too much detail or, you know, not feel like they're, I don't know, it's too scary to read through scholarly work, things like that.
Well, I certainly think you succeeded in that regard, and
Yeah.
I'm not at all biased in judging this, by the way.
Yeah.
And there's a fascinating essay included in this anthology called "The Maker Remade Mary Shelley in Fiction,"
Mm-hmm.
which actually talks about the various different films that were made about her life. There were actually 3 films made about her life in the 1980s. This was the first one, Gothic. A couple of years after, there was not one but two. There was Haunted Summer and Rowing with the Wind, which I haven't seen, by the way. But yes, it's a fascinating read, and that particular essay will, probably illuminate the subject of Mary Shelley in fiction, much more articulately and profoundly than I ever could.
Yeah, I believe that's Matthew R. Davis. He's a really good friend of mine, and he is such an interesting person. He's a very well-known horror writer in Australia, so definitely look him up. He's very funny. He's very tall. He's very, very cool. But I was very excited when he actually approached me with that topic, because I thought, wow, like there are so many really cool films about Mary Shelley and about the Shelley gang. So that was a really cool essay to edit and work with him on.
Well, getting back to the subject of Gothic, which is the film we're talking about today, and I do believe it qualifies as a 1980s fantasy film for any listeners who are skeptical because they're hearing us talking about historical figures. This film is very speculative, and it introduces supernatural elements. Lays that over the top of real-world historical events. I mean, we know that Lord Byron and Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley and her half-sister Claire Claremont got together for a weekend at the Villa Diodati, a mansion near Lake Geneva in Switzerland. And while they were there, when they were really bored, they decided, let's entertain each other by telling each other ghost stories. And from this came, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but also Lord Byron's physician, John Polidori, who was there. He wrote The Vampire, which maybe isn't as well read these days, but it was a very seminal work in vampire fiction. It established a lot of the core elements of vampire mythology that we take for granted today.
Yeah.
But
even before Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Yeah. The thing is, this film, Gothic, postulates that they didn't just tell each other ghost stories to entertain themselves. What they did was they got really, really high on laudanum, and then decided, hey, wouldn't it be fun if we took this human skull and we used it as a conduit to summon the spirits of the dead? So they conduct a seance, and they summon this supernatural entity, this shape-shifting entity that takes the form of their worst fears and haunts them with images of their deepest guilt and deepest pain. And this, bizarre, supernaturally fueled dreamscape ensues, where everyone there is... they're high to begin with, so they're already tripping out. But then it's made even worse when the ghosts come along and start making all of their worst fears come true, basically.
Oh God, I've seen this movie quite a few times, and it's just so funny hearing someone else explain it, because just listening to you say that, it makes me think, what is this? How is this even a movie? But it's so crazy. It's so frenetic. It's so bizarre and otherworldly. And I think it's got, it's full of anxiety. You're watching it from scene to scene thinking, what is going to happen next? But you just can't look away from it. It's like a disaster. It's a train wreck. You can't look away from it. But it's also so good at the same time.
Yeah, well, what you were saying, how did this become a movie?
Yeah.
I've got a theory about that. Can I just elaborate on my pet theory here?
Mm-hmm.
Well, this film is directed by a British filmmaker named Ken Russell. He made a name for himself in the 1960s and 1970s with a bunch of films that really pushed the envelope in terms of screen representation of sex and nudity. Some of these films were literary adaptations that had a certain amount of prestige. He adapted D.H. Lawrence's novel Women in Love, and he adapted Aldous Huxley's novel The Devils of Luton into a film called The Devils. Some of them were also outrageously inaccurate biographies of famous artists. Probably the most famous from that time period was The Music Lovers, which was about Tchaikovsky. And then in the early 1980s, he did a film that was like the cinematic equivalent of a bad acid trip. He did a film called Altered States, which starred William Hurt as a kind of mad scientist who experiments with LSD and sensory deprivation tanks, because he thinks by doing this he can discover the meaning of life. It doesn't work out so well for him in the end. But,
you think?
But the film, which is full of all this, fever dream, hallucinatory imagery, the film was profitable.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure when Ken Russell was shopping this script around, it was written by a guy called Stephen Volk. Maybe they picked Ken Russell for this because they thought he was a good match for the material. I don't know. But the thing was, I can imagine a producer thinking to themselves, right, Ken Russell wants to make a film that's a period film about famous literary figures, and it's shot like a bad acid trip. He has a proven track record of success doing all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
So if he makes a film that combines those three things together, like, outrageously inaccurate biography, literary figures, and acid trip visuals, it's sure to be a hit.
What do you mean inaccurate? All these things happened. Definitely. But I can totally see why they would think that it would work, because he is known to make this kind of film. So you're going to allow someone to do that. But critics are divided on this movie.
Well, unfortunately, it wasn't a box office hit. And as you said, critics tend to be divided along love-hate lines, but then that's pretty much been the case with all of Ken Russell's films.
Yeah.
Even his most commercially successful film, which I think was his adaptation of The Who's rock opera Tommy, that also divides people to this day. But about the accuracy of certain scenes. I don't usually make notes when it comes to this podcast, but because I knew that you knew lots of things about Byron and Shelley, and I took notes of some scenes, and I'd like it if I could ask you a series of questions about certain scenes, and you could answer me with a simple yes or no.
I can try. I don't know everything about them, but I will try.
Yeah, it's just 6 questions, basically. Okay. In all of your sort of scholarly research on Byron and the Shelleys, could you find any evidence that, during this, wild weekend, Percy Shelley would strip naked and walk around on the rooftop of the villa in the middle of a thunderstorm to be at one with nature?
Do you know what? Yes. There are several accounts of passers-by who said that they saw a strange man standing on top of the rooftop, shouting at the wind.
Really?
Would you believe no?
Okay, next question. Is there any evidence that Claire Claremont would strip naked, smear mud all over her body, then crawl round on all fours, hunting rats, which she then proceeded to chow down on raw?
Well, I went back in time and I questioned the rat. The rat told me about their address straight he was eaten by this woman. I have to say no. I do not believe there's evidence that she did that.
Okay. Was there any evidence that Lord Byron kept this clockwork automata, this sort of belly dancer shaped automata that was basically like this robot stripper that he kept in his basement? Any evidence for that?
Well, yeah, I bought that off eBay a few years ago. Unfortunately, no, I don't think there's evidence of that.
Okay. What about Lord Byron getting this servant girl, this maid, to strip naked and wear a mask and wear a mask that's designed to look like the face of his sister. And then Lord Byron, he cries out his sister's name as he fucks her.
Would you believe there is no evidence?
What else have I got? Okay, 2 more questions, really. First of all, did Percy Shelley keep a journal?
Yes.
Okay. In his journal, did he do sketches of mountain ranges that were shaped like female breasts, and sketches of topless maidens that had eyeballs where their nipples should be?
Yes. So, while Percy Shelley, I'm fairly sure he had a journal and he used to write letters. They're all very big letter writers. I don't think he even doodled, eyeballs with nipples or anything like that along the edges of the letters or journals that he kept. Unfortunately not.
Just in a more general sense, is there any evidence to suggest that they got totally high on laudanum and then held orgies?
I just don't think so. I mean, there is that weird farmer who was also high on laudanum and said that he had an orgy with Percy Shelley, the poet.
Are you serious? Did that really happen?
No. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
I don't think any of these happened.
Okay, and I heard that Lord Byron had a relationship with Claire Claremont and had a child with her.
Yeah.
But was he also trying to bone everyone else there on that weekend? Because in the film he's like running around sexually harassing everybody else in the house, male, female, whatever.
You know what? We can't know this. We don't know. There's been a lot of experts who have been trying to find more information about this kind of, time. And we can only assume. So maybe. I don't know if he was frenetically running around naked, like half crazed, trying to bone everyone, but he was a romantic gentleman who had affairs with many women, and we can only assume that he was trying to get it on this weekend.
Yeah. Anyone who hasn't seen this film, who stumbled on our podcast, is just like, I swear to you, I'm not making this up. All of the stuff that I've just described is actually in the film. Like it's just a small taste of like the phantasmagorical, hallucinatory imagery that's like scattered throughout this movie. It is like, I've never been on acid. I've never really messed around with any hard substances because I'm epileptic and I have to take medication to control my condition. So, yeah, I've never messed around with hallucinogens or anything.
Mm.
So I can't say how well this film captures the sensation of being high and tripping out. But I imagine, like, from friends of mine who've had bad trips, I imagine it's something like this. I don't know.
All I can say is that, I've never had acid. I may have partaken in a few other things. But I also have epilepsy. However, Ben and our epilepsy is different. I take medication as well. But on particular things and is imbibed, I have not tripped out and or hallucinated all these weird things. So I have not had some kind of phantasmagorical experience on drugs. So this is all completely new to me, and the chaos that ensures is something that I have never actually been involved in.
You know, when people ask me, do you like a film? You know, I usually have a very, very strong feeling one way or the other. Honestly, I don't quite know how I feel about this film because, like, I can see why a lot of people would find it outrageously offensive.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And just, you know, from a storytelling point of view, like if what you want is a coherent narrative with a straightforward beginning, middle, and end, this is just a mess. This is just... as you say, the imagery is so compelling.
Yeah.
So crazy, so, unpredictable.
Yeah.
It's just,
and like,
it's just an assault on the senses.
The thing is, so like we've mentioned, phantasmagoric, and for anyone who doesn't understand, it's like phantasmagoria is sort of a type of like horror theater that people would use that would they would either project images of like creepy things, so like demons and ghosts and skeletons and creepy crawlies. And so that was one of the earliest ways to scare people, to frighten people. But with this movie, it's like a hedonistic kind of phantasmagoria where they use all these kinds of things to unravel the sanity of people, to make people, to turn them crazy, I suppose, which is really, really interesting and cool because other films, they mainly focus a lot on Byron himself, on Byron and the serious aspects of his life. And they don't go into anything crazy like this or anything remotely similar to this.
You know what this film reminded me of? And this might seem like a really bizarre comparison. This film reminded me of a movie from the 90s called Dragon, the Bruce Lee Story. Now, hear me out, Claire. The reason why it reminded me of that was Dragon was a movie that basically fictionalized Bruce Lee's life in a way that made his life seem more like one of the movies that he was in. To the point where, like, the finale of the movie has Bruce literally fighting off the specter of death with nunchakus. And, it's an outrageously inaccurate biography, but it's I don't know, it really captures Bruce's flair as an artist. It captures his spirit in an odd way that I think a more accurate biography wouldn't have. And I think that with Gothic, what they were aiming for was to produce a film about these artists that captures the spirit of what their work was like and puts you in that sort of phantasmagorical space that was often the subject for their fiction.
Actually, that's a really good point because the more when I was researching them as people, they were also just larger than life creatives. They were considered pretty out there, and which would probably be tame now, compared to our kind of counterparts, I suppose. But back then, that kind of Shelley gang, which is what I call them, they were pretty wild and they did a lot of crazy things. So,
wasn't Lord Byron the first person that someone described as mad, bad, and dangerous to know?
Yes, yeah. And so obviously you want to get to know this guy. You want to have a party with this guy, He actually makes me think of someone who's like, counterculture in the 60s or something like that, He makes me think of artists and things like that who would be so completely crazy that you just don't know what they're going to do next.
Well, I heard this, I guess, urban legend about Byron, and I've never bothered to look up whether it's true, that someone approached him at a party who didn't know who he was and said to him, "Oh, so what do you do?" And he just glared at him and said, "I am evil," and then walked off. I have no idea whether that's true or not. Well, I'd like it to be true, and I'd like to think, like, imagine what this guy would have been like today if he had a Twitter account or something.
So I just thought, okay, so he kept just saying that makes me think of he was probably like the Andy Warhol of his time. You know what I mean? He just says, whatever he wants, whatever he wants, because he had he would have had such an artistic freedom to just do whatever he wants. Based on what we know from him, research and what he said through himself and letters about him and how people described him. He's especially perfect for this movie because he's like a character in himself.
Well, what's the phrase that, if he didn't exist, you'd have to invent him, but if you'd invented him, you wouldn't have believed it.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know. This movie, I can see why it's an acquired taste. And I think to enjoy it, you have to take three things. You have to take three things on board. the first thing you have to accept is that it plays fast and loose with history. I think that Ken Russell's previous film, Altered States, was a success because it tried to do the same thing in like creating this nightmarish imagery, this sort of, hallucinatory, drug fantasy imagery, but it wasn't tied to real life people who actually existed. It was a complete work of fiction. So there wasn't anything to people to be offended by the slanderous misrepresentation of real people that there is in Gothic. The second thing I guess you have to accept is that there's explicit nudity. The laudanum, the intoxication, it just frees these people of all their inhibitions and they go like crazy. And they're all really horny and they have a lot of like repressed issues with regards to their sexuality, especially Byron and his issues with his sister. Oh God. Anyway, yeah, lots of nudity abounds, and like it's all very stylistically done. And I would like to say that it's artistic, but honestly, I can't intellectually justify it and defend it from charges of being gratuitous. I guess the third thing you have to accept is that like any notions of a coherent narrative take a backseat to just like shoving imagery in the viewer's face that Ken Russell thinks is cool. And I guess capturing the logic of dreams, the sensation of being stuck in a nightmare, I guess that's the feeling he wants to create with this film.
One of the things like that I was thinking about it when I was watching it is if we view it not as a crazy kind of retelling of what happened, but actually maybe look at it into, it's not a biopic or anything, it's kind of like an exploration into maybe like an artist's mind or like an artist himself. Not everyone, obviously, but maybe if we think of it as like Ken Russell looking into the psyche of a creator, he's looking into this time where these privileged writers, and they were privileged, a lot of them created one of the most memorable, like horror works of the time. Like they all did something. Well, most of them did something that is still, to this day, so completely important to literature. Maybe people are misunderstanding it of a film,
Well, yes, I think you're right in the sense that it's trying to explore the fractured psyche of these people. I mean, it does bring up like real life trauma that these people went through with Mary Shelley, her struggles with like miscarriage and dealing with that. But also, I would say perhaps it's a meta commentary on the mythology surrounding these artists. It's not just that their work has inspired this dense modern mythology in countless like reinterpretations and adaptations of things like Frankenstein and Don Juan, but also just there's a mythology that's sprung up around these individuals as people.
Yeah.
To the extent that there's all these kinds of urban legends about them, and like the one I just repeated to you, which might not even be true about Byron at that party, but yeah, this thing Gothic could be like, you could look at it as an exploration of the myth of these people.
Yeah. And one of the things that I actually really liked about Gothic was with Mary Shelley, as the night progresses and, the thunder is roaring, it's chaotic, everything like that. Mary Shelley, like, she sort of, I guess, she judges her peers, but, she judges people and she dismisses her own thoughts and feelings. She's like, I'm not going to succumb to this and things like that. But then she does. And then she starts to think about all things that she perceives to be failings, which is what Mary Shelley actually felt. Like so Mary Shelley had many miscarriages and multiple children died. Only one of her child actually survived infancy. But in this movie, she's thinking about this. She's thinking about, like, the jealousy she has of her sister. She was thinking about, I guess, probably the duality of herself as a woman, you know, her mother being the famous feminist philosopher, Mary Wollstonecraft, you know, and she's probably thinking about that. And then the way that she was raised by, like, her dad, she's trying to exercise her own demons, you know what I mean? Like, she is trying to exercise the demons of her past and her present, I think.
Yeah, and I think she's also struggling to reconcile her own morality with her friends and loved ones, people that she cares about who she knows have strayed. And I thought one of the most powerful moments in this film was actually where Mary Shelley calls out Byron on his behavior and says, like, she says, and I'm paraphrasing here, basically, once you cut through all your poetic turn of phrase, all your philosophy amounts to is you feel entitled to be a jerk. And you are a massive jerk to everyone. She says it in the film much more eloquently than I just did. And I thought that was just a powerful moment. And she totally owns Byron in that moment, by the way, in the film. He doesn't have a snappy comeback to that. Like, because she's right, really. Yeah. You know, Byron had a way with words, but he was a jerk. I mean, he was a massive jerk.
He was. But one of the things that I really liked about Mary Shelley is that she stood up for herself. She stood up for everyone. And she would confront people. And we know this through a lot of her letters and a lot of letters written about her as well. And we don't know everything about their relationship, but we do know that she would put him in his place and just say, you know, stop being such a jerk, stop being such a dick, like, basically. But then they had that relationship where they could acknowledge that and just say, oh yeah, you know, like, there are some letters from Byron saying, you know, admitting, I'm paraphrasing, I've been a bit of a dick to Mary today, probably shouldn't have, you know, but that's true, like, that's from what we read. Their interactions are very true.
There's a very potent, dramatic chemistry between all the different actors assembled for this film. And I feel I should talk about what a phenomenally gifted ensemble were brought together for this film.
Yeah.
I mean, in retrospect, it might almost seem like an all-star cast, but none of them were really well known at the time, I don't think. But yes, and they take it seriously. Like, they bring the gravitas of like a Shakespearean play or something to this film that could be considered exploitative trash. Or I know that a lot of critics dismissed it as such, as just being mindless sensationalism. But yeah, the cast actually, I think they would have been brilliant if in like a more sober dramatization of these events. They could have carried these parts well. But they do a phenomenal job with what they're given here.
Yeah.
And we started with Mary Shelley. And I might as well... Can I wax lyrical about Natasha Richardson for a moment?
Of course you can, because she's amazing. Yeah.
People listening to this might be surprised to hear that Natasha Richardson was cast as Mary Shelley in this, because her life was tragically cut short, but before that she was mostly known for her roles in romantic comedies in the 90s and noughties. But yeah, in the 1980s she was, you know, actually a rising dramatic actress, and she starred in a succession of very grim films. She was in the original version of The Handmaid's Tale, the title role in that. Quite an underrated movie, I think. She played a kidnapped heiress turned terrorist in Patty Hearst, the film with the Patty Hearst story, and she played J. Robert Oppenheimer's suicidal mistress, Jean Tadlock, in this obscure film about the Manhattan Project called Shadowmakers that was released in some territories as Batman and Little Boy.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, she goes all out in this. She pulls out all the stops, and she's like the calm at the center of this storm. Well, as much as like everyone goes insane over the course of this like dark and stormy night, but she's the one who keeps the clearest head of them all.
I think she's amazing as Mary Shelley. I think she really, I don't know, I just think she's great. Like, we don't know a whole lot about Mary Shelley and like who she was, the way that she, presented herself. We don't know any of these things. And that's one of the things about films like this, is that even though we know a lot about people through writings and historical events and stuff like that, we don't know much about what they look like. Like, there are portraits of Mary Shelley, of course. But Natasha Richardson just seemed to bring her to life and make her so sensual and creative and vivacious. And
well, yes, Natasha Richardson.
cool.
Natasha Richardson was an incredibly beautiful woman, and
Yeah.
I like her. Probably one of my 1980s screen crushes as well. But
Yeah.
she was also a very nuanced actress, and I love the way in this film how she delivers all these cutting remarks that bring people down to earth, but without raising her voice.
Yes.
It's really, really amazing what she does. And yeah, pretty much every movie I've seen her in, I keep wondering why did she never become a big star? I guess because a lot of the movies themselves are pretty weird, like this one. But yeah, I mean, she plays off the other actors well. So I should mention Gabriel Byrne as Lord Byron as well. Like, I don't know, the minute he steps onto the scene, I was just like, yeah, this guy's mad. This guy's mad, bad, and dangerous to know. I mean, he has like, and I don't know much about Lord Byron and what he was really like as a person, but Gabriel Byrne just seems to perfectly fit the archetype of the Byronic hero, and he has the dark looks, the brooding, smouldering gaze, and he's good at playing both the tortured soul of Byron, the kind of wanky angst of the character, but also the rage and fury of the character, and the sort of creepy, lecherous side of him as well.
I guess for people who wanted to know more about Lord Byron, and also it's why I think he is amazing as Lord Byron as well. He does such a good job as portraying Lord Byron. What we know about him was that he was basically a hedonist. Like, he was, hedonistic. He defied social norms. He went out of his way to do everything against the grain. He had tumultuous love affairs, like just so many of them. He had all these illegitimate children. He gambled. He had debt. He basically did whatever he wanted. But the thing is, he also he was witty and satirical, and he was funny. So I guess that is the flip side of what he could have become, some crazy socialite playboy, which he was, but he was also thoughtful and interesting, and he was articulate, and
I think maybe his way with words might have been why people let him get away with so much, because it reminded watching him in this, I was just reminded of how people make excuses for their favorite celebrities, their favorite artists when they misbehave, and like his demeanor in this reminded me a lot of like modern rock stars, and like
he was he was considered like a rock star at that time. He was very popular, and so with like Gabriel Byrne, I was like, what's it going to be like? But he did it so well, and I think also he's got those looks. He's got the dark hair and I don't know, those eyes, his steely eyes. Like, I just think he did a remarkable job of portraying this crazy, wild man. He was really good. It was a big chick for me as Lord Byron. He was great.
We're both on the same page then with Byrne as Byron. Both on the same page there. I find it a little harder to judge Julian Sands as Percy Shelley and Timothy Spall as Dr. Polidori, because those are the characters that are affected the most by all the substances that they're imbibing, and they do spend most of their screen time like totally baked, just totally. I don't know what's the word. What's the word for when you're tripping out on laudanum? They're just like totally off their face,
off their chops. Oh. And that's the thing, we can't I can't really compare them to their realistic counterparts because they're just crazy on drugs.
Well, they both look convincingly out of it, and I think, can I just say that I think that Julian Sands and Timothy Spall get something about being drunk or being high that a lot of actors don't get when they're playing, people who are intoxicated. The fact that when you are intoxicated, when you're really intoxicated, you're so far gone that you're not aware that you've lost your mind, and you think that you're being sophisticated when actually you're not. And they capture that sort of delusion of people who are saying nonsensical things but think they're being sophisticated when they're doing it.
Mm-hmm. And there are like certain parts where they're all just sitting around having discussions and just chats about things. But it just made me think of actually, like, I don't know, uni students sitting around chatting about like all these political things and all these kinds of like political theories and things like that. But they're just not making any sense. They're just
Miriam Sear as, I think I'm pronouncing that right, Miriam Sear as Claire Claremont. I mentioned that I thought of Byron as like a rock star in this. I think of Claire Claremont as being like a bit of a groupie here.
Yes. So she was the stepsister of Mary Shelley, and she was the mother of Lord Byron's daughter, Allegra. And she was someone who, so when Mary Shelley and she decided to travel around with, I guess, like a bunch of people. She did a lot of traveling. But Claire Claremont, she just wanted to come along. She was sort of like jealous, I suppose, in a way. And we know this again through a lot of writing about her and from her own writings. I guess she's someone who, she knew who her mother was, but she wasn't really sure who her father was. I actually think of her as somewhat of a tragic character because she was completely in love with Percy Shelley. Like, she wanted to, have meetings with him and things like that. But then obviously, like, that didn't go anywhere because her sister was with him. So Claire Claremont was the person who actually convinced Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley that they should go to Switzerland. So she was someone who was very pivotal in this whole affair. And you could say in the writing of Frankenstein, like, obviously Mary Shelley could have written Frankenstein anywhere else. We don't know. But at this point in time, Claire Claremont was someone who was like, let's go. Because she was someone who, I think she felt like she wasn't in the fold, that she felt a little bit that she was sort of outside the edges. She wasn't really part of her sister's sort of literary kind of life. So she said, we should go. At that time, we're not sure if she knew she was actually pregnant with Lord Byron's illegitimate child. Gossip. But they certainly knew when they actually got there, So in a way, like, he actually didn't want to, see her. He was just like, nope, like, you can only be here if the Shelleys are here, you know what I mean? He was just like, basically, go away. I don't want anything to do with you. So take that we will with Byron's personality, I suppose, but he pretty much dismissed his pregnant mistress and only allowed her to be there because his besties were going to be there.
Yeah, like I said, I get the impression that, a lot of Byron's free-loving philosophy, was created to basically give him an excuse to be a jackass.
Yeah, and he was. Like, he even spoke about it. Like, he called her a fool. He called her, like, I think he was saying how, like, like a little girl, and saying that she wasn't smart enough for him to actually marry or be with or anything like that. She was just foolish little girl that he never loved her. She was, I think 18 anyway. Still holds up there.
Yeah, well, in the film, Miriam Sear plays her as this sort of, free-spirited, bubbly, sort of, I guess, life of the party.
Yeah, and that's what we've known her to be.
I was going to say, Miriam Sear in this film plays her as a kind of free-spirited, bubbly life of the party to begin with. And then when she takes the drugs and the supernatural entities start assaulting her mind, she just she becomes completely unhinged. Probably the most unhinged of all the characters.
I actually thought that was interesting because it made me think of her as a person, like of Claire Claremont and the shit she went through. Really, I don't know. Like she didn't have a very good life. Like she was sort of like she was someone who sort of mixed in with people. Like she was described as someone who mixed in the throng. You know what I mean? She's like a groupie, as you mentioned. And she never really had a particularly happy life from, what we know about her. To be part of this would have been awesome for her. And yeah, she was a groupie in a way. So she was definitely someone who I could imagine being here, taking drugs, doing crazy stuff.
Well, yeah. And I think that, as I said, this very accomplished ensemble helps sell the relationships between the characters, even when the script is sort of painting them in very broad strokes. Yeah. The actors, I think they give some nuance to these characters that isn't there on the page, it isn't there in the dialogue, and the elaborate visuals are kind of glossing over these things, but the actors bring it to the forefront of their performances. I suppose I should mention the visuals now in more detail. The cinematography in this movie is just something else. It is so, like I said, it's a dreamscape. It's phantasmagorical. It's hallucinatory. Like all these hyperbolic phrases that I'm using, which probably sound over the top. I don't think they really cut it in describing it actually.
I think it all works together really well because of it has so many it's the seat in beautiful horror elements, and it's so stylized and it's surreal, and it amplifies both there's a romantic elements to it and the frightening elements to it. And I wouldn't say that it is horror itself, but it's about horrifying things. It's about horror, if that makes sense.
Well, the apparitions that the characters are confronted with are variations on their worst fears. And that's what pushes them over the edge.
Yeah.
So if you empathize with the characters, you can feel their pain in a way. I was also going to mention how some of the shot composition in this is modeled after famous paintings from the period. The image that appears on a lot of the posters and the DVD cover for this, which has Natasha Richardson's Mary Shelley sprawled out on a bed and this goblin-like figure perched on her chest, about to claw her face off, or just looking menacingly directed at the camera. That's based on a famous painting by Henry Fuseli called The Nightmare. There's all of these moments in the film where it feels like there's a focus on a famous painting or sculpture, and then it cuts to, an image that's sort of modeled on that, or, reminiscent of that. And these sort of go on, then they go off in a completely different nightmarish direction. It's really interesting, and part of it, I think, part of the eerie ambience of this, I have to mention this at some point, is the anachronistic synthesizer score by Thomas Dolby.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know much about Thomas Dolby, I must confess. All I know is that he had this hit pop song in the 80s called She Blinded Me with Science.
Which is very different.
And
music in it.
His score for this movie is this I don't know, weird mix of classical, kind of idioms, played out on synthesizers and, pounding drum machines for tense moments. It's bizarre and totally out of sync with the time period, but somehow I feel it fits the mood perfectly.
Yeah.
I feel bad that I didn't do any more research. I'm sure Thomas Dolby has done, many more sort of deep and profound works than the ones we're talking about. But I have to say that, like, Gothic, for whatever else he's done, Gothic is just like sort of the most eerily unsettling music I've ever heard in a film. Even if it's for a film like this, it works so well.
It does. But it's also sort of just like cool, if that makes sense. Like it's just cool music, because then it seems like it shouldn't fit in a historical kind of film. But then when you think about it, this film isn't really just a historical film. It is like a crazy dreamscape movie.
I guess the fact that these characters are besieged by otherworldly forces, it kind of makes sense that the music that's the motif for these supernatural forces should be out of time, out of step with their normal lives. Yeah. That's the best way I can justify the presence of this electronic music in this period film. That and I feel it still works anyway.
Yeah.
Well, that's the film in a nutshell. I mean, the film is crazy. I mean, like, and I feel like, okay, this is my defense of Gothic.
Yeah.
For what it's worth. Like, this is a film about people who are completely off their gourd on drugs and going crazy. And perhaps it makes sense that a film about people going crazy should be shot in a crazy style.
I think one of the reasons I like about it is that it is based somewhat in reality. It is.
Okay.
No. But I mean, like, it is based on what, actually happened and when they were, on the warm summer night in, 1816 at the Swiss, chateau of Lord Byron. But I think there's a lot of important themes in it. There's like themes about the imagination and, I guess necromancy. But like, what could be possible? And makes me think of Mary Shelley and losing her children and going through quite a tumultuous life and upbringing. She vehemently hated her stepmother. They did not get along at all. But this movie, I think, is great because it has so many emotions and so many different things that we can think about.
Well, the fact that you, as someone who has studied Mary Shelley's life, feel that there are parts of this movie that are true to the spirit of her life.
Yeah.
Even if this is not a literal representation, and it takes some very extensive artistic license with, the events of her life. If you feel that it still captures some of the turbulent emotion that she went through when it came to like certain traumas that she experienced in her life, I think in that sense it must mean that the movie's doing something right, and that there's a deeper layer to it than just, mindless sensationalism. It's not just shock for shock's sake.
No, it's not. And I think it does have that psychological depth to it because it adds, because it has the characters exploring, their fears and desires and their hopes and, through hallucinations, but they are still very real fears and hopes and desires and things that they're scared of. And so I think that adds layers of depth to this very bizarre movie. And I think that, also the actors, they give such strong performances that, it brings them to life. They're so compelling. It doesn't matter if they're doing crazy shit on screen and it's so wild, but they're so compelling as actors that they make the characters who are real people so compelling as well. I just think it's really fun and it's really cool, and there are so many elements to it that are just interesting,
Well, yeah, that's your perspective as someone who has studied these historical figures in depth. My perspective as someone who is just a cinephile who wanted to see a trippy horror film, my perspective is it delivered the goods in terms of the phantasmagorical imagery. It was wildly unpredictable, and it was, and it really captured the feeling of being stuck in a nightmare. I mean, there were bits of it where the imagery was a bit goofy, but at the same time, there are other bits that really shook me to the core and it scared the living daylights out of me. And I think it's partly because it taps into the logic of dreams, the logic of nightmares. But also, as you said, there is a deeper emotional nuance to the characters' relationships, which shines through despite like all the sensationalism, all of the, blood and nudity and other like horrific imagery that's in this that a lot of people tend to focus on when they're discussing the film. I think there is that deeper layer to it. So as purely a work of cinema, I think this is a trip worth taking.
Yeah. And
my final takeaway from this film is that it did impart a very important message that I think people can learn from, and that, I will carry with me for the rest of my life. And that is, if you are going to summon the dead, don't do it when you're high. No matter how bored you may be. Like leave the summoning, especially not if you've never done it before. Like, leave the summoning of the dead to experienced professionals who are sober.
Yeah, that's what I think.
That's all for this week, folks. Thanks for listening. If you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing and sharing this podcast with your friends. If you have any questions or would like to provide suggestions for future episodes, you can send an email to fantasypodcastfeedback@gmail.com. Until next time, cheers.